lived long enough to know that money doesn't create character. It only gives loud people a stage. Real strength doesn't announce itself. It shows up early, leaves late, and keeps its mouth shut while doing the work nobody thanks you for. I've seen men with gold watches fold under pressure. And I've seen men with rough hands carry entire families without complaint. The world rarely notices the second kind until someone tries to humiliate them in public. That's when everything changes. Because quiet men don't argue. They don't shout. They don't beg to be respected. They wait. And when they finally stand, the room never sounds the same again. What happened at my son's wedding taught me that lesson all over again. People love to confuse money with class. They think tailored clothes mean decency. They think clean nails mean clean hearts. But class shows itself in how you treat people who can't give you anything back. My son Gideon never had much money. What he had was responsibility. He paid his bills. He kept his word. He raised his child when it would have been easier to fall apart. I've watched wealthy people sneer at men like him for decades. They smile politely while deciding who belongs and who doesn't. They forget something important, though. The men they dismiss are often the ones holding the foundation together. And when you insult a man like that in front of his family, you don't just embarrass him. You wake something up. Gideon is my only son. He's the type who'd give you the coat off his back and apologize for the wrinkles. He worked jobs that left his body sore and his hands cracked, and he never once complained where his daughter could hear it. After his wife died, he didn't fall apart. He showed up. Every morning. Every night. He learned how to braid hair, pack lunches, and sit through school plays without missing a beat. Men like Gideon don't ask for respect. They assume it comes with doing right. Sometimes, they assume wrong. On the morning of that wedding, Gideon believed he was walking into a celebration. He didn't know a woman with money and sharp words had already decided he didn't belong there. He didn't know laughter was waiting for him. And he had no idea that before the vows were spoken, he would be forced to choose between swallowing the insult or ending everything they thought they owned. If this kind of humiliation ever reaches your family, you'd want warning. Subscribe. If you won't subscribe, explain why in the comments. Gideon didn't plan to raise his daughter alone. No man does. Life handed him that role without asking his permission. His wife passed when Sloane was still learning how to walk. One moment, Gideon had a partner. The next, he had a house full of silence and a child who cried for a mother who wasn't coming back. Grief didn't give him time to sit down. Bills still came. Diapers still needed changing. A tiny hand still reached for him in the middle of the night. So he learned fast. He learned how to carry sorrow quietly. He learned how to be gentle without being weak. And most of all, he learned how to show up every single day, even when his heart felt heavier than his boots. Raising a child alone doesn't break a man all at once. It wears him down slowly. Gideon worked 2 jobs for years. One paid the rent. The other paid the future. He wore the same boots until the soles split. He drove a truck that rattled like it might quit any day now. But Sloane never knew that fear. She never missed a meal. She never missed a school event. She never heard her father complain about how tired he was or how little sleep he got. Gideon believed children should feel safe, even if their parents don't. That kind of consistency doesn't earn applause. It just earns calloused hands and a quiet reputation for being dependable. Gideon never talked about sacrifice. He didn't keep score. He didn't expect gratitude. When Sloane danced, he clapped the loudest. When she cried, he listened. When she succeeded, he stepped back and let her shine. I watched him sit through plays he didn't understand and cheer for grades he never bragged about. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise his ego. Men like my son believe love is something you prove through repetition, not speeches. That belief would later be tested by people who had never lifted anything heavier than a champagne glass. I was proud of Gideon. Still am. But I worried about him too. Men who carry everything alone often forget they're allowed to defend themselves. They mistake patience for duty. They mistake silence for peace. Looking back now, I realize that wedding wasn't just about joining families. It was about how much disrespect a good man would be expected to swallow, and what would happen when he finally refused. Sloane was 24 when she told us about Preston. She said his name carefully, the way people do when they already know it carries weight. She talked about how polite he was, how well he dressed, how he opened doors and remembered birthdays. She said he worked in finance and came from a well-established family, though she didn't quite know what that meant yet. Gideon smiled the whole time she talked. Not because of Preston, but because his daughter was glowing. He didn't ask about money. He didn't ask about last names. He asked one thing only. "Does he treat you right?" Sloane nodded. And for Gideon, that was enough. At least, he believed it was. I met Preston's parents a month later at a small dinner. Eleanor Whitaker arrived dressed like she was attending a gala instead of a restaurant with chipped plates. She scanned the room before she smiled, deciding where we fit. She spoke pleasantly enough, but every sentence carried judgment. Where we lived, what Gideon did for work, how long our family had been local. She laughed softly at her own remarks, as if kindness were optional when curiosity had already done the damage. I noticed something else too. Eleanor never asked Gideon a single question that didn't involve measuring him, and she never looked at him long enough to hear the answers. That told me everything I needed to know. Gideon didn't see what I saw. Or maybe he did, and chose to ignore it. He said Eleanor was just particular. He said Preston came from a different background. He said people need time to adjust. I pulled him aside afterward. I told him plainly that families who care that much about appearances rarely stop at one judgment. Gideon smiled and said, "As long as Sloane's happy, I can handle a few looks. That's the danger with men like my son. They think endurance is the same as respect." Sloane was dazzled. Not by money exactly, but by access. Dinners where reservations mattered. Friends who spoke confidently about vacations we'd only seen on postcards. Homes with gates instead of porches. She began choosing her words more carefully, dressing a little differently, laughing at jokes that didn't quite land. I don't blame her for wanting more. Every child wants a smoother road than the one they grew up on. But I watched something shift in her. She started believing that fitting in required silence, and that silence would later cost her more than she realized. Eleanor corrected Sloane in public. Preston didn't stop her. Eleanor joked about rough edges. Preston smiled nervously. Eleanor referred to Gideon as simple. Preston looked away. Each moment passed without confrontation. Each moment was added to a quiet list. And when people don't push back early, they teach others exactly how far they can go. Eleanor Whitaker didn't need to raise her voice to dominate a space. She carried herself like the rules bent for her automatically. When she entered a room, she paused just long enough to be seen. Not to greet, just to be noticed. She wore expensive things with the ease of someone who never checked price tags. Her smile came late after assessment. I've known women like her my whole life. They don't ask who you are. They decide. Eleanor spoke as if every opinion she had was already agreed upon. When people laughed, it wasn't because she was funny. It was because they were careful. She treated politeness like a favor instead of a standard. And from the moment she met Gideon, she treated him like an inconvenience she hadn't ordered. Eleanor loved the word standards. She used it the way others use excuses. She had standards for weddings, standards for families, standards for who should stand where what, and speak when spoken to. What she never explained was who set those standards, or why they always placed her on top. She talked endlessly about legacy, about lineage, about how things are done. She spoke as if her family invented good taste, and everyone else borrowed it poorly. When Gideon spoke about Sloane's childhood, Eleanor redirected the conversation. When he mentioned working overtime, she changed the subject. His life didn't fit her script, so she edited it out. That's how people like her operate. If they can't control the story, they silence the storyteller. Eleanor never insulted Gideon directly at first. She didn't need to. She commented on his clothes without naming him. She joked about certain professions. She spoke about presentation while looking everywhere except his face. She asked Preston if everything was arranged properly, then glanced at Gideon's hands. She asked Sloane if she was prepared for adjustment, then smiled thinly in my direction. Every word was chosen to wound without leaving marks. That's the trick. If the target reacts, they look unstable. If they stay quiet, the behavior continues. Gideon stayed quiet. People take cues from power. When Eleanor dismissed Gideon, others followed. Not openly, but subtly. Conversations shifted when he joined. Jokes stopped short. Invitations were addressed vaguely. No one confronted him. They simply reduced him. I watched people who had never met Gideon decide he wasn't worth knowing. They didn't ask about his life. They didn't ask about his sacrifices. They trusted Eleanor's judgment because it came wrapped in confidence and money. And when no one challenges behavior like that, it spreads. By the time the wedding week arrived, the tone had already been set. What disturbed me most wasn't Eleanor's behavior. It was Preston's response to it. He saw everything. The looks, the comments, the way his mother controlled the temperature of every room. And he chose comfort over courage every time. When Eleanor spoke over Gideon, Preston looked away. When she corrected Sloane sharply, he stayed quiet. When lines were crossed, he pretended not to notice. That told me something important. A man who won't defend his future family before the ceremony won't defend them after. Insert cleanly after this section, before moving to the rehearsal dinner. Some say Eleanor was protecting her family. Others call this cruelty. What do you think? The rehearsal dinner was held in a high-end bistro in Alexandria. Small tables, polished silver, wine glasses that reflected the chandelier light like they were auditioning for a magazine. Gideon arrived straight from the construction site, hands washed, suit pressed, shoes dusty but polished enough to pass a glance. I watched from the corner, my hands folded in my lap. He greeted everyone politely, carrying the quiet dignity that had raised Sloane, built our family, and kept our small home standing. He didn't know that Eleanor Whitaker had already made a decision. He would be measured, mocked, and found wanting before anyone even clinked a glass. Eleanor approached him like a predator sizing prey. She didn't extend her hand. She didn't smile. She simply looked at the hem of his trousers and, loud enough for the bridesmaids to hear, whispered, "I suppose some people think semi-formal means don't wear work boots." The group tittered politely, the sort of laughter that's careful not to upset the person with the checkbook. Gideon's hands clenched for a brief second. He didn't respond. He just nodded and carried himself forward, like a man who knew he had bigger battles ahead. I wanted to stand, to shout, to tell her she had no idea who she was mocking. But Grandma knows restraint has its own power. And Gideon knew it too. Whenever Gideon tried to share a memory about Sloane's childhood, Eleanor interrupted. She spoke over him about floral arrangements, wine vintages, and family pedigrees. His stories, filled with love and sacrifice, were reduced to background noise. Guests laughed politely, uncertain where to place their allegiance. Sloane tried to interject, but her voice was drowned by Eleanor's precision. Every anecdote, every joke, every quiet testament to a father's devotion was dismissed with the ease of a hand swiping dust off a shelf. And yet, Gideon remained silent. He did not argue. He did not complain. He simply waited. That waiting, though quiet, carried more weight than any insult thrown at him. The night ended with polite applause. Everyone smiled, plates cleared, wine poured. No one suspected that this was only the opening act. Gideon carried himself home with the same quiet strength he always had, unaware that Eleanor had plans far more humiliating for the wedding day itself. She had already planted seeds of doubt in Sloane's mind, turning innocence into compliance. And in doing so, she had underestimated one thing: the depth of Gideon's patience and the weight of what he was capable of when provoked. The morning of the wedding was deceptively quiet. Gideon sat in the church basement, adjusting the tie Sloane had given him years ago. It wasn't silk, wasn't expensive, but it was meaningful. Every crease, every fold, reminded him of birthdays, recitals, and nights spent wiping tears from Sloane's pillow. He hummed softly, unaware that a storm was already forming above. Eleanor Whitaker had spent weeks preparing, not flowers or decorations, but humiliation. She wanted Gideon erased, removed, made to feel small in front of the 300 people who had gathered to celebrate her son. I watched from a corner, lace gloves folded neatly in my lap. I could see the faint tremor in his hands, though he wouldn't admit it. He was a man who bore weight without complaint, but I knew the hours ahead might push even him to the edge. It came quietly at first. Eleanor, speaking to Sloane with a practiced smile, murmured just loudly enough for the photographers to catch a glance. "Maybe your father shouldn't walk you down the aisle. That limp might ruin the video." The words weren't cruel enough to cause immediate outrage. They were calculated. A suggestion that Gideon wasn't enough, that his very presence would interfere with the perfection of the wedding. That the labor of decades, the love and care he had poured into Sloane's life, could be dismissed with a few casual syllables. Sloane didn't react. She smiled nervously, trying to placate her mother. Gideon didn't hear it yet, but even from my vantage point, I could see a quiet shift, like the room had tilted just slightly and the tension hummed beneath polite conversation. I could almost see the thought forming in Sloane's mind. Maybe Mother is right. Maybe Father shouldn't be here. She hesitated, freezing at the sound of her mother's voice. Gideon, unaware of what was being said, remained seated, carefully holding the small velvet box meant for Sloane. A gift, a symbol, a promise, a shield. And that's the danger of silent cruelty. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It seeps into the heart, into confidence, into trust. It waits until the moment you're least prepared to defend yourself. I gritted my teeth. I wanted to stand up and warn Gideon, but I knew better. This was a test, one that would determine not just how he faced humiliation, but how he would reclaim what was rightfully his. From my corner, I felt the weight of what was coming. Eleanor had underestimated Gideon. She thought a few whispered words would bend him. She thought submission could be taught. She was wrong. This wasn't just about a wedding. It was about respect, dignity, and the years of sacrifice Gideon had poured into Sloane's life. And every second that ticked closer to the ceremony was another second where he remained unaware of the true depth of the insult. I took a deep breath, reminding myself, patience is power. Watching a good man be tested doesn't weaken him, it sharpens him. And when Gideon finally acted, the impact would be absolute. Eleanor would realize, far too late, that you can't belittle someone who has quietly built an empire of integrity. Gideon sat in the basement, the velvet box balanced carefully on his lap. The weight of it was light compared to the burden he carried every day, but heavy enough to remind him of what mattered most. Sloane, blissfully unaware of the storm her mother had set in motion, flitted upstairs, adjusting her dress, smiling at friends. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and faint candle wax. Gideon's hands rested lightly on the box, thumbs brushing the edge. His body was tense, but his face was calm. A lifetime of quiet endurance had taught him the rhythm of waiting. When insult arrives, stand firm. When betrayal comes, hold fast. When injustice is imminent, remember who you are. I watched him as I have watched him for decades, steady, unyielding, a man who had carried more than most would ever know. This small box held more than a gift. It held meaning, history, and the quiet promise of a father who never wavered. He didn't think about humiliation. He didn't think about anger. He thought about Sloane. He thought about all the mornings he woke early to make sure she had breakfast. All the nights he stayed up comforting her tears. Every scraped knee, every lullaby, every hard-earned lesson was in that small, folded box. It was more than an object. It was proof. I could see the anticipation in his posture. His hands, steady on the velvet box, betrayed a quiet determination. Every man should be judged by what he protects, not by what he can purchase. Gideon had spent years protecting, providing, guiding. Now he was about to protect the dignity that others thought they could strip away. And Eleanor, she had no idea what was coming. She believed the insult, the whisper, the dismissal had broken him. That night, she was planning another move. Little did she know, the true response was waiting, quiet and deliberate, in that basement. The velvet box was a silent herald. What lay inside would not just surprise. It would shift power. It would change perception. It would remind everyone present that actions, not appearances, define worth. And for anyone watching, this is a lesson. Some of the most powerful moments happen in quiet rooms, long before anyone notices. Gideon's patience, his restraint, and his unwavering love had built a force stronger than status, stronger than wealth, stronger than condescension. What was inside that box changes everything. Subscribe to see the moment unfold. And if you won't subscribe, tell us why in the comments. Don't leave the story half told. The stone chapel was quiet, though hundreds of people had arrived. Gideon entered slowly, adjusting the tie Sloane had bought him. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't trying to impress. He was simply present, the man who had carried a family on his shoulders for years. Eleanor Whitaker arrived moments later, gliding through the entrance like she owned every brick. Her expression was a curated blend of delight and superiority, calculated for effect. Every eye seemed to follow her, every whisper perfectly timed. I could see Gideon take a deep breath, steadying himself, and holding the small velvet box like a shield. Sloane floated behind him, oblivious to the storm already building. She was happy. She believed the day was about joy and love. She hadn't yet grasped how fragile her father's dignity was in the hands of people who mistook status for worth. Before the ceremony began, Eleanor, glass of champagne in hand, summoned attention from her inner circle. Her voice, calm and deliberate, carried across the vaulted ceiling. "Look at him. He's not a father, he's a disaster in a cheap suit. I offered to buy him something decent, but you can't dress a plow horse in silk and expect him to gallop." The women around her giggled softly, their laughter designed not to offend her but to signal approval. The entire room seemed to pause, caught between polite attention and discomfort. Sloane, standing nearby for final photos, smiled weakly. Her nervous chuckle was meant to smooth things over, but it did something far worse. It confirmed Eleanor's narrative. Gideon froze. His shoulders sagged slightly, not from defeat, but from absorbing the insult in real time. His eyes dropped to the floor, though he did not move. His silence carried more weight than any retort could. I could feel my own chest tighten. Here was a man who had given everything, facing contempt from a woman who had never lifted anything heavier than her wineglass. And still he waited. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Some leaned in, pretending to check their phones. Others whispered, trying not to make eye contact. It was as if the chapel collectively held its breath, waiting to see if Gideon would break. Sloane's nervous laugh hovered in the room like a thin veil. She didn't yet understand that in that moment, she had chosen submission over loyalty. And while she intended to smooth ruffled feathers, she had, without realizing it, deepened the humiliation. Gideon did not flinch. He did not speak. He merely stood, gripping the velvet box. His restraint made the room lean in, as if curiosity itself wanted to witness what would come next. And I knew, from decades of watching my son, that he would not be humiliated without purpose. I could feel the tension coil like a spring. Men like Gideon don't react instantly. They measure, observe, and let others expose their true character. Eleanor believed she had orchestrated a flawless display, the room's attention, Sloane's obedience, and her own triumph. What she didn't realize was that a man who builds his life on patience and sacrifice carries a weight no one can take away, and a power others underestimate until it's too late. Every slight she threw became a mark in a ledger Gideon had carried for decades. Every whispered jab, every polite laugh at his expense added fuel. And when he finally moved, it wouldn't just silence Eleanor, it would expose everything she thought she controlled. I sat there, lace gloves folded, heart pounding. We all know men like this. We've all seen them overlooked, underestimated, and assumed weak. And when they finally act, it's not a fight. It's an awakening. I leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift in the room. The murmurs began to falter. Even Eleanor's confident smile tightened, unnoticed by most. Preston, standing by Sloane, hesitated, unsure how to intervene. Gideon's grip on the velvet box tightened. He wasn't just holding a gift. He was holding the symbol of decades of sacrifice, of integrity, of every moment that Eleanor and her circle had attempted to belittle. And that small, deliberate pause before action, the kind only someone who has suffered quietly knows, was the kind of moment that changes the entire room. What followed would be a pattern interrupt the likes of which the guests would never forget. Preston stood near Sloane, shifting his weight nervously. He saw the way Eleanor's eyes pierced Gideon, how the whispers and subtle laughter flowed like water around him. He noticed the tension in the room, the way guests leaned back in chairs, uncertain where to look. He understood, in a fleeting moment of clarity, that his mother had overstepped. Yet he did nothing. Not a word, not a gesture, not even the smallest attempt to defend the man who had given his daughter everything. Instead, he leaned close to Gideon, whispering, "Maybe just stay in the back for the photos, okay? We don't want to clash with the theme." It was advice disguised as concern. But to me, it was the unmistakable mark of fear. Gideon's eyes flicked up at Preston, and in that instant, the room seemed to freeze. I could see the mix of regret and discomfort in Preston's posture. He wanted to avoid confrontation at all costs. He wanted harmony, or at least the appearance of it. And that is when I realized something about men who avoid conflict for comfort. They teach others exactly how far they can push. Gideon's patience had been immense until this point. Every insult, every whispered jab had been recorded silently in his mind. But Preston's cowardice shifted something. It was no longer just about a cheap suit or a cruel mother. It was about respect and the absence of it. Gideon's head snapped up. The hurt in his eyes vanished, replaced by a clarity I hadn't seen in years. It was the look of a man who had endured enough and decided that no more patience would be given to those who undervalue him. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He didn't even glance at Eleanor yet. He simply reached into his pocket, gripping the velvet box tighter, and began to move toward the altar before the music had even started. The chapel went silent. The organist fumbled a note. Guests froze. Preston's hesitation revealed every weakness, every lack of courage, and inadvertently created the stage for something the Whitakers would never forget. I whispered to myself, knowing exactly what was about to happen. Men like Gideon don't need provocation once they've seen true disrespect. They simply act. And when they do, it's not just a response. It's a lesson that echoes through everyone watching. If silence scares you, subscribe. This is where truth speaks. And if you won't subscribe, explain why in the comments before the story unfolds. You won't want to miss what happens next. Gideon's movement was deliberate. He stepped forward, one booted foot in front of the other, the velvet box held like a banner of quiet defiance. Guests froze mid-conversation, the chatter fading to a hush. Cameras clicked, but no one wanted to break the spell. Even the organist paused, fingers hovering above the keys, waiting to see if this was part of the ceremony or an unscripted act. Eleanor's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her perfectly rehearsed control was slipping, unraveling faster than she could blink. I could see the shift from my seat. This wasn't just walking, it was a statement. Every inch of that aisle declared that dignity cannot be bought, borrowed, or borrowed from anyone else. Gideon had become the center of attention not because he sought it, but because the injustice demanded it. A wave of silence moved through the crowd. Guests shifted uneasily, realizing this was no ordinary wedding moment. Whispers stopped. Eyes darted between Eleanor, Preston, and the man in the cheap suit who dared defy her. Eleanor's lips tightened into a line. She took a small step forward, heels clicking against marble, a futile attempt to reclaim dominance. But Gideon didn't look at her. He didn't even pause. He moved with the quiet certainty of a man who had been underestimated all his life. Every onlooker felt it. The air had changed. The balance of power, once assumed to favor wealth and pedigree, was tipping. And the person controlling it was the man everyone had written off. From my seat, I watched him. I've seen Gideon endure heat, cold, physical labor, heartbreak, and loss. I've seen him carry grief silently, and now I saw him carry courage. This was the moment he had been preparing for, though none of us realized it. The velvet box was more than a gift. It was a symbol, a promise, and a signal. Those who laughed before, those who doubted before, and those who assumed weakness before, were all about to understand the cost of underestimating a man who had spent decades acting with integrity. And Eleanor, she was realizing too late that control is an illusion when confronted with patience, principle and quiet power. The world she had built around status, and money had no armor against a man who refused to be diminished. As Gideon reached the altar, the room felt frozen in anticipation. The guests' murmurs faded into silence. The bridesmaids' smiles faltered. Preston's hesitation became obvious, and Eleanor's confidence cracked. And there, in the middle of the aisle, Gideon paused. Just a breath, just a small shift of the box in his hands. It was enough to make the audience lean forward, sensing that something monumental was about to occur. What he would do next, what he was about to reveal, would rewrite the narrative of the entire day. The whispers Eleanor had set in motion would collide with a quiet, deliberate authority no one in that chapel expected. This is the turning point you can't afford to miss. Subscribe now, or risk missing the truth when it hits. And if you won't subscribe, leave a comment explaining why. You'll want your voice heard before the story unfolds. Gideon stood at the pulpit, the velvet box now open, revealing not jewelry but documents folded carefully inside. The chapel had gone utterly silent. Every eye turned toward him. Even Eleanor's carefully cultivated composure trembled at the edge of collapse. He cleared his throat, and the voice that had spent decades speaking softly in workshops, construction sites, and quiet kitchens now carried authority that filled the room. You're right, Eleanor. I am a disaster in a cheap suit. A man who works 12-hour days to raise a daughter alone. A man who doesn't know the difference between Pinot Noir and Merlot. He paused, letting the murmurs swell and then fade. He continued, but there's one thing I am that you seem to have forgotten. I am the owner of the ground you're standing on. Gasps rippled through the audience. People shifted in their seats. Some clutched programs. I could see Eleanor's hands tighten around her champagne glass. Her eyes widened, disbelief painted across her face. She thought she had power. She thought she controlled the narrative. And now she understood she did not. Gideon unfolded a yellowed parchment and held it for all to see. 25 years ago, the Whitaker family business teetered on bankruptcy. Preston's grandfather came to my father, a simple farmer, seeking a private loan to save the estate from the bank. My father gave it to him, secured only by a silent deed to this land. The words landed like stones in a still pond. The guest's polite posture stiffened. Eyes darted to the corner of the chapel where Eleanor stood, her confidence crumbling. Whispers started, but they quickly died, replaced by stunned silence. Gideon continued, My father never called in that debt. He told me, Gideon, as long as they are good people, let them keep their pride. And I honored that. Today, I was prepared to sign the land over to Preston and Sloane as a wedding gift. Debt-free, $10 million. Every word was deliberate. Every syllable landed with the force of a reckoning. Eleanor's color drained, her breath caught. She had underestimated the quiet man in the cheap suit, the man she mocked and dismissed, the man who had been silently watching her cruelty unfold for decades. Then Gideon's voice hardened, calm but unyielding. But today, I learned the Whitakers don't value good people. They value cheap suits and pedigrees. Eleanor, you instructed your guests to deny me. You told them I was not a father. If I am not a father, then I am a businessman. And as a businessman, I have made a decision. He held the modern deed transfer, then tore it down the middle, each rip echoing through the stone chapel. Paper shredded like thunder. Gasps and whispers followed, frozen expressions mingling with disbelief. He tore it again, leaving the fragments in his hands. The original 99-year lease on this land expires at midnight. Tomorrow, it reverts to my family's trust. Since I'm a disaster, I will turn what was once your empire into a home for hard-working men you look down on. The silence was absolute. Eleanor stumbled back, clutching her chest. Preston went pale, realizing the world he had assumed was secure had just crumbled. I stood, smoothing my lace gloves, watching the chaos unfold. This was the power of a quiet man pushed to the edge. Not rage, not violence, but undeniable authority. Gideon's patience had built an invisible empire. His dignity had been the foundation, and now it was the instrument of justice. The chapel, once dominated by social hierarchy, now revolved around principle. Wealth and pedigree could not stand against sacrifice, integrity, and love. Every guest saw it. Every whisper confirmed it. Eleanor's reign of condescension was over. Sloane, frozen, finally understood the depth of her father's life, the quiet toil, the relentless devotion, the unseen victories. And in that moment, I knew that no one, not even the Whitakers, could rewrite the story of who Gideon was. If you think you can ignore the quiet ones, think again. Subscribe now, or risk missing the lessons that silence hides. And if you won't subscribe, explain in the comments why you're leaving truth unheard. Gideon held the deed transfer in his hands, the legal proof of what had once been the Whitakers' secured empire. The chapel's silence wrapped around him like a cloak. Eleanor's expression wavered between rage and disbelief. Preston's mouth opened, then closed again, frozen by fear and awe. He had been given the choice, though few realized it. He could have stayed quiet, allowed the celebration to continue, and let the humiliation pass. Or he could act, and in a single deliberate motion, reclaim everything that had been wrongfully undermined. Gideon's hands gripped the paper, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the act he was about to commit. Every shred of patience, every day of silent sacrifice, every whispered insult that had gone unanswered now funneled into this single, irreversible decision. And then he did it. The paper tore cleanly, the sound cutting through the air like a verdict. A sharp inhale ran through the pews. Guests instinctively leaned forward, caught in the gravity of the act. Gideon tore again, ripping the document to pieces small enough to scatter, yet large enough that the destruction spoke volumes. This wasn't just revenge. It wasn't vindictiveness. It was the culmination of a lifetime of quiet endurance. Every insult Eleanor had whispered, every laugh at his expense, every slight toward his dignity had been recorded. And now, the ledger was balanced. The fragments of paper fluttered in the air, some landing at Eleanor's feet. Her perfectly pressed dress couldn't hide her shock. Preston's jaw dropped. The room seemed suspended in disbelief, as if time itself had paused to witness the exact moment justice was delivered without violence, without anger, only principle. Gideon's voice rang out, calm, controlled, and impossible to ignore. The $10 million gift I intended for this family is gone. Torn. Reclaimed. Because the only thing that matters more than wealth, status, or approval is respect. And respect cannot be commanded, it must be earned. Every guest understood the gravity. Whispered conversations fell silent. Those who had laughed moments before now stared in quiet realization. Eleanor's power, built on condescension and inheritance, was undone by the very man she had dismissed as a disaster in a cheap suit. The chapel, once filled with anticipation of a lavish ceremony, was now a monument to a single truth. Integrity, sacrifice, and patience wielded wisely are forces no arrogance can withstand. I sat back, smoothing my gloves, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. A quiet man, underestimated for decades, had transformed humiliation into authority, condescension into accountability, and insult into a lesson for everyone present. We all know men like Gideon, quiet, steadfast, endlessly patient. And we know the danger when they finally act. Not because they are loud or violent, but because they are deliberate, principled, and impossible to ignore when pushed past endurance. The room had learned something invaluable that day. Wealth and status are temporary. Character and courage are permanent. And no amount of pedigree can stand against decades of unbroken integrity. We've all seen those underestimated, quiet men. Subscribe now to witness the full story of their strength. And if you won't subscribe, tell us in the comments why you're leaving the lessons of courage unheard. Eleanor Whitaker's face turned an unconvincing shade of red as the torn deed pieces fluttered at her feet. The room's silence was deafening. Not a single guest dared speak. Their polite smiles and carefully measured conversations had vanished, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. Preston stumbled backward, realizing the future he had assumed was untouchable had just crumbled. He glanced at Sloane, but she could barely meet his eyes. She understood, finally, that the foundation of their lives, the wealth, the status, the image, was gone, swept away in a single, deliberate act. Eleanor's hands trembled as she tried to gather herself. Her control had been her identity, her power, her currency in a world that respected pedigree above principle. And in that moment, she had none. She was left exposed, powerless, and entirely accountable. The whisper started slowly at first, then grew, spreading like wildfire. The socialites who had laughed at Eleanor's jabs now turned away, deleting her number, shaking their heads in quiet condemnation. Invitations evaporated. Business calls went unanswered. Every connection she had counted on now treated her with caution, suspicion, or outright disdain. Word of the torn deed traveled fast. In a city that worships image, Eleanor's facade crumbled instantly. People realized that a lifetime spent valuing status over integrity leaves one unprotected when true character asserts itself. Guests who had once smiled at her antics now quietly discussed her arrogance, her short-sighted cruelty, and her failed control. Preston's so-called legacy was no longer secure, and Eleanor was left standing amid the ruins of her self-created empire, forced to confront the consequences of underestimating a quiet man in a cheap suit. I watched from my seat, feeling the quiet satisfaction of witnessing justice served without malice. Gideon had never raised his voice. He had never sought revenge in the way people expect. And yet, his patience and principle were more powerful than any fortune. This was the lesson everyone in that chapel would carry with them. True strength isn't loud, it's deliberate. True power isn't flaunted, it's demonstrated through integrity, and true respect isn't given because of wealth, it's earned through a lifetime of character. Eleanor's collapse wasn't just personal, it was public validation for every man who had quietly labored, endured, and sacrificed, only to be dismissed by those who measure worth by money and pedigree. If you think this couldn't happen to someone you know, subscribe now. Learn the full stories of quiet strength before it's too late. And if you won't subscribe, explain in the comments why you'd ignore the warning signs of injustice. Sloane stood frozen, her eyes wide, tears brimming as she processed everything. She had spent so long chasing approval, blending into the world of wealth and prestige, and now she finally saw the truth. The man who had raised her, who had given her everything, her father, was more valuable than the fortune and the social standing she had once longed for. Preston remained speechless, his confidence shattered. The mansion, the inheritance, the future they had counted on, none of it mattered anymore. The weight of reality pressed down on him, and he understood that their lives could no longer continue under the illusions Eleanor had built. I rose slowly, smoothing my lace gloves, feeling the gravity of the moment. The chapel had grown quiet once again, all eyes on me. My voice carried not just authority, but truth. Sloane, honey, your father spent 20 years making sure you never felt cheap. The moment you laughed at that woman's joke, you became the only thing in this room that was low class. You didn't just lose a dowry today, you lost the only man who ever loved you for your heart instead of your last name. The words hit like a hammer. There was no room for misinterpretation. Every guest understood the magnitude of the statement. Eleanor's face fell further into despair. Preston's jaw tightened. Sloane finally let herself feel the sting of misjudgment, realizing her father's love could never be measured in wealth or status. It was priceless. The moment was complete. The marriage, as it had been conceived under the shadow of pride and superficiality, had ended before it even truly began. The chapel had witnessed the final reckoning. Gideon's silent authority, Eleanor's downfall, and Sloane's awakening all converged into a moment of undeniable truth. I sat back, satisfied that the lesson had landed. People needed to understand that love, respect, and integrity are the real currencies in life, not money, titles, or appearances. Every glance, every gasp in that chapel confirmed it. If you don't act when injustice strikes, who will? Subscribe now to see the lessons quiet men teach before it's too late. And if you won't subscribe, leave a comment. Tell us why you're choosing to ignore the truth unfolding right before your eyes. By morning, the consequences of Gideon's decisive action rippled outward. The Whitaker estate, once a symbol of wealth and control, had lost its foundation. Banks, now aware that the land rights had reverted, froze accounts and called in loans. The country club, the chapel, and every luxury property built on that land faced immediate uncertainty. Eleanor Whitaker, once untouchable, found herself isolated. Her former allies, the socialites and business connections who had laughed at Gideon, now kept their distance. Invitations vanished. Calls went unanswered. Reputation, long assumed to be permanent, had collapsed in hours. Meanwhile, The community watched. Those who had once overlooked hardworking men wearing cheap suits began to see the value of character, sacrifice, and integrity. It was a lesson whispered through streets, shared in kitchens, and remembered in quiet corners. Respect cannot be faked, and arrogance has a cost. Gideon, despite having the power to humiliate further or seize the full fortune, chose a different path. He organized a sale of the Whitaker mansion and estate, but instead of keeping the millions, he redirected them to create a foundation for single fathers in the county. Men who, like him, labored, sacrificed, and persevered for their children without recognition. The foundation became a testament to quiet strength. Every brick, every grant, every opportunity it offered reflected the man who refused to be diminished. Gideon's cheap suit became a symbol of integrity, and his patience, once overlooked, became legendary. The Whitakers, stripped of their illusion of control, were left to reconcile with the consequences of their choices. Prestige, wealth, and social standing were temporary. Integrity, love, and perseverance endure. Sloane and Preston married quietly at the courthouse a week later. No flowers, no socialites, no extravagant venues. Preston, for the first time in his life, earned a paycheck. Sloane called her father often, tears in her voice, slowly grasping the truth. A father's love and guidance are worth more than every mansion, every check, every inherited title. Yet Gideon kept a boundary. He answered her calls, but Sunday dinners remained a privilege, not an expectation. Lessons, after all, must be earned. I sit now on my porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills. People ask if I feel bad for how it all went down. I tell them, a man in a cheap suit who pays his debts is worth 10 men in tuxedos who owe their souls to the bank. It wasn't money that silenced the chapel. It was the sight of a good man standing tall, finally. And let me tell you, there is nothing more formidable to a bully than a quiet man who has finally had enough. We all carry quiet strength, patience, and integrity. But when those are tested, the results echo far beyond one family, one chapel, or one day. That is the legacy of Gideon, and the warning for anyone who underestimates the men who act without fanfare, yet with purpose. If you don't witness quiet strength, you risk forgetting what courage looks like. Subscribe now, or leave a comment explaining why you'd ignore lessons that can change lives. Don't let injustice go unchecked.